on the spot.
So here we are. I'm here with Kiera Bell, Beck Wonders, Sinead, and Brindis, who's also filming. And everyone was having a nice conversation until I got the camera out, and now everyone's like, Did you have a good day today?
Yes.
Super.
Especially once we got to the pub. Just getting started today.
Yeah, man. Well, we took about 3 hours to get served with a pint, so now we're having many pints.
What was the name of this one? Like Munich. The eunuch. I can go with that. Nice. If we want to get controversial, I'll debate yous on feminism.
Oh, whoa!
Okay, first point. Patriarchy doesn't exist in this country.
Ooh.
Go on.
Yeah.
I guess we need definition of patriarchy.
Okay, well, as are women in Scotland oppressed by men and they don't have any of the positions of power or influence?
It's not about having, like, you can have women in positions of power. That doesn't then mean that patriarchy doesn't exist.
So what you define patriarchy for me?
And men's oppression of women.
Okay.
So, for instance, well, I mean, so many different things, just in terms of, expectations, in terms of, unpaid labour, childbirth. Obviously, the big one is the fact that they murder and rape us. Mm-hmm. The fact that now we can't even talk about our biology, and that's a hateful thing to do when we're being...
Hi, sorry folks. Who ordered the pretzel?
That was me.
I'm afraid not many pretzels. Would you? I can change it for fries instead if you'd like. Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
Will it take a long time? Or?
it should be about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes.
That's fine.
Are they free because they weren't what you ordered?
Yeah.
There you go.
Nice one, Sinead.
Got one for curry sauce or Jaeger sauce, or just one.
Free girl, I'll go with that.
Yeah.
There's a creamy mushroom sauce.
This is interesting. This is I don't cut. This is real life. So yeah, we are in an actual pub.
I'm going to have a smoke of Where's the Wind Blowing, so I can position myself so the smoke doesn't blow in.
We're all smokers here, aren't we?
I know too many
Here
non-smokers.
doesn't smoke, and I'm always...
I think the issue with a lot of these discussions is definitions, and people have different definitions of different things, and I think we're often arguing tilting at windmills and things that people don't actually believe, and we don't have a clear definition. Well, we don't have a clear definition of man and a woman, trans, trans,
There's only fucking idiots that don't know what a man and a woman is.
Yeah.
Maybe let's talk about the origins of patriarchy, because a lot of people, a lot of women have made the argument that the evolvement of patriarchy went parallel with the accumulation of private property as well as agriculture, right? Because women's reproductive systems were then also recognized as a resource which could be extracted, right? And so that is a relatively new historical system. It's only around 5,000 years that this has been happening, right? When you consider, and I think it's important to consider that there was a before time, because a lot of the times...
sorry, because I don't know if you've ever read Less is More. I forgot his name. Some Jason Hicks or something like that. But there's this like fallacy that prior to the current system that we have, that we couldn't live as individuals and have our own homesteads and have our own skills. There was a whole community which was based off of I make this, you make that, we buy off each other. And with the whole Enclosure Acts and things like that, I very much agree that would. I don't know if that's the origin, because I think there's a biological aspect to it in terms of men's psychology, but that
but it's interesting, that conversation, because it comes down to like how you make sense of male domination. Obviously men benefit from it, but whether that's an ingrained... I mean, Julie Bindel says this thing of like, we're the radical feminists are the ones who like believe in men's humanity, because we're the ones who like think that you don't have to be like porn sick pedophiles, right?
But the other the flip side is patriarchy is not necessarily good for men. I would consider myself first and foremost a humanitarian. you know, and I don't believe that it's healthy for men to
Free chips.
think that they are the dominant sex and that they need to then perform that. And
yeah, it's not healthy in a psychological sense, but I think it benefits
and a
them in a
spiritual
structural
sense as well.
But it has benefits in terms of
Oh,
like a
of
structural
course.
sense, right? But like this is a problem. It's like, you know, obviously, yes, women are represented in politics. Women are represented in all kinds of fields where they weren't, you know, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So, you know, this is a good thing. Whether that means that patriarchy doesn't exist, I think is another question, because this is the whole. Sonia Johnson is an amazing American feminist who came from a really religious upbringing, and she ended up actually opposing the Equal Rights Amendment because she was saying, look, they can grant us this, they can grant us all these equal rights, which means that they can take it away as quickly as they've granted it to us. So it depends on what you think of, I guess, what you think of what patriarchy is, what the opposite of patriarchy is. Is it patriarchy, women's liberation? Is it something else? And like, what would that look like? What would like women's emancipation and liberation in society look like? Would it mean having all of these institutions that we now have where we're represented, or would it mean a complete overhaul of the systems that be? What do you think?
I mean, when I have sort of debated with feminists about this type of thing, they've always, and it might not be the official definition, but the one they give me is that patriarchy is the systematic oppression of women. And my argument to that would be, well, our monarch's a woman, the Home Secretary's a woman, our First Minister here's a woman. There's no job in this country on higher paying ranks, whatever it is, that a woman can be discriminated and not allowed to continue.
Do you think a woman can't be misogynistic then?
Oh no, I believe women can be misogynistic.
So, but what you're seeming to say there is that because we've got these women in these positions, that therefore means that, you know, well, you're saying that therefore the patriarchy doesn't exist.
Because women have been granted positions of power, and if the
But they're
definition
being
is the systematic
granted these
oppression of women,
positions, but they're being granted these permissions under patriarchy. It's the men that are granted these positions.
how so?
Well,
This is
because it's a cultural thing. Patriarchy is not just a question of position, money, wealth, property, material things. It's a cultural thing as well. So, I mean, you can be a woman and you can be just as misogynistic as some of the most misogynistic men, because it's a culture, and that's. Yeah.
Well, the system relies on the collaboration of women in our own oppression. Like it would, you know, and there's many reasons why that happens. But I think it's really important to come to terms with complicated women. Like Helen Lewis talks about this in her book Difficult Women, about like, you know, for example, who's the woman who did contraception?
Mary Stopes. Mary
Stopes, and you know, she was the first woman who like created women's clinics and provided contraception. She was also a eugenicist.
This is the thing. I think a lot of how many of women's reproductive rights have been granted because of eugenicist platforms, not because of feminist platforms. It's about controlling the working classes and keeping them to a manageable amount of people. And also, I think when you look at the fact that in America, like the fact that black women are a lot more likely to have abortions than white women, and whether or not that's class-based or otherwise, I think there's a huge question to be asked about that, which nobody wants to talk about, because to question abortion rights is to question some huge pillars of feminist thought, and I think that makes us unable to ask broader questions about these things, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think, see, when it comes to oppression, I don't think people are oppressed based on sex. I think they're oppressed based on class. I think, like, it doesn't matter if you're a male or a female.
But women are a sex class. We are a sex class. I mean, how would you then define class?
Economic class.
But no, that's true.
70% of the world's working classes and the world's poor are women, so maybe it's a conflated issue, but I think that both of your arguments can be put together maybe somehow, and we can, you know, does that make sense?
The axes of oppression are generally sex, class, and race, right? Like, and depending on how those axes intersect in your life, you're going to have a different experience and a different position in terms of like how you're oppressed. I do think, like, when it comes, it's interesting, like, the idea, the queen, the monarch, and the first minister, those all being women, I think that's really like an important point to consider. I'm not sure that that representation alone means that women are liberated in society, just because it's like in the 60s, right? Like the women who worked in the left movement, the women who rose to the top in the left, in the socialist left, were women who
adopted masculinity.
Who performed male ideas, right? And that's actually one of the starting points of the women's liberation movement. It's all these women coming together and being like, hang on, we need to get together and develop our own ideas about society outside of the male kind of hierarchy of the way we organize and structure society.
Circles. Right? It's all about circles. Men are lines, and men are queues, and men are platforms.
Pyramids.
Women are exactly, and women are circles. And I've been saying this for a while. I want to see more circles within the feminist movement. And what I would actually say is that women in positions of power, if anything, I believe is potentially detrimental to the feminist movement, because it gives this fallacy of if you look at the current gender movement, and a lot of women talk about how did we get here, and they talk about in the 90s there was a real stagnation of feminism, and it's like when you look at that and people's perception of patriarchy and of women's oppression is not what it was in the height of the second wave feminist movement, and as a result they don't see it as a threat to women's safety, because there's not that recognition there that yes, we are still oppressed, we are still murdered and raped and all of these things, constantly dogged and harassed, and do you know what I mean? And I think this is the danger, and you've got this kind of people like Cardi B, Megan Thee Stallion, and all this fucking crap, because I as a woman and I'm in this position, I've chosen to put myself in this position, then we can completely ignore any cultural or any kind of
structural.
Do you know what I mean? And it's so ingrained. And also, let's talk about the otherism of women. We live in such a competitive, we're taught to be competitive.
We live in a male-dominated society, and the ideology of neoliberalism, for example, is a very masculine identity. This concept that you can be an individual that is not in relation to anybody else.
Individuality, I would say, is masculine, because as a woman, you bring life into the world. You can't. How can you? I mean, obviously, I know men, but it's not the same. There's not that kind of I don't believe there's this. I think a lot of individualism does come from the male psyche, because there's not that
reciprocity.
Exactly. And like they say, Mother Nature, Father Capital, environmentalism. How do you solve the climate crisis? You fucking educate women. Sorry, I shouldn't swear. You educate women. Literally, that's the number one way that you solve the climate crisis.
Sorry, what are you saying, Sinead?
So see if we were to just dial it back to the personal for a second, and I was to say, I'm a woman, been a woman for 30 years. You never felt oppressed. Don't feel oppressed. How am I oppressed in this country?
We're on a subconscious level.
Feeling oppressed versus being oppressed. Is there something beneficial to talking about the feeling of it?
You either are or you're not.
Well, I don't know. Maybe there is something to be said about not feeling what.
Okay, well, how am I oppressed then?
Well, we could get started. Well, I would.
Please do.
Well, I would say even your situation is because of your biological reality. I don't mean to be.
No, I don't mind you talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at the number of young women, but not just young women, and this is something, we want to talk about young women being transition, but we need to make the distinction between these are vulnerable young women. These are not just, nice middle class, young girls that have gone to a nice private school. These are vulnerable young women that are being funneled into something.
There are vulnerable young men as well.
Of course, sorry. And it's the exact same thing. I feel the exact same way, regardless of whether it's a man a boy or a girl. It's fucking wrong. In any, you know, when we look at mental health, you know, we've come so far in so many respects, but yet, what is this like, you know, like, so if you're anorexic, you know, oh, well, that's a mental health problem, and that's different from your biological reality, that's different from your body, but yet somehow with the trans thing, you know, it's all about your body.
Thank you for coming.
You know, there's like a real disconnect. There's like, it's so strange, and that's where actually I was like, wait, that's strange. What? There's something else going on here.
Yes, thank
you know,
you.
because
First time up here. So.
I mean,
Do you agree with this? I don't know if you'd call it a theory, but when people talk about the reason that there's this massive rise in young women and girls specifically going to gender clinics, do you think that it's particularly it's a social contagion aspect? Or
there is an aspect. I mean, when I like, so when I was young, so I was adopted the first time, so I basically, her name was Laura, and she wanted a really, really feminine girl, but she had 2 other boys, one of them was autistic, and I felt very like, I want to be a boy, like I would, like, you know, like, and so there's that aspect. A lot of girls fear becoming women because you do become, you know, like, even when I look like fucking shit and I go to the shop, like, I've been attacked for like, not, like, there is like, you know, and I think there is definitely that side. There's the side of, you know, even like people that just outside of the trans, well, not outside of it, like the whole non-binary thing. It's like an otherism. It's like I'm different, and we live. I believe actually going back to the land-based thing and community and things like that. The dissolution of a land-based culture in which we live around the land, we work around the land, we share physical skills and things like that. And what you've now got is like an online community. Everything is online. Where do you get your community from? You get it from looking at Instagram. You get it from people that you want to be like. I was on Tumblr. A lot of the self-harm that I did and things like that came through Tumblr. Exactly. You know, and it's a funnel for vulnerable young people because it's like a safety. It's like a, you know, I want to be part. We have an innate need to want to be part of something as humans.
Yeah.
And they put all of this psychology that's ever been done. It's not ever been done for our benefit. It's been done to manipulate us. I believe.
Can I just say that, like, one thing that reminds me, like, what you said, you know, this idea of like feeling oppressed. I think that a mistake that a lot of women make is to think that we don't have power, because I think women do have power. That's the reason, and that's the resource that is being extracted, right? Like, and it's this like intentional giving up of and relinquishing and just accepting, you know, our position rather than understanding ourselves as inherently powerful. So I think
the problem is when you incorporate it into your identity. Like, I'm an oppressed person, and it's the same thing like with race. Like I don't feel oppressed due to my race walking about. Like I'm not an oppressed person. That's not part of my identity. That's not how I see myself. Like I'm much more than that. And there are opportunities out there for me as a woman or a black woman or a mixed race woman to go out there and do things. It's just the structures that are at play. But,
yeah, for sure. I also think like it's important to consider, like, you know, we live in a really globalized world. Like, if I as a woman am not structurally oppressed, or like say I'm you know, financially stable, I have a good job, I've never experienced male violence in my life, like say I have occupied that position, I think it's really important to recognize that like most women in the world are not in my position, especially coming from a country like England or Scotland, like where the legacy and ongoing legacy of these places in the world is one of like violence and you know, looting, and you know, understanding that like a lot of women globally, you know, and I get so mad when the kind of gender identity line is saying that the idea that sex is binary is a colonial construct, when their whole ideology, the idea that you can be born in a wrong body, the idea that, you know, there's this innate essence that only you can know and it exists through outside affirmation, like, is being spread across the world in an imperialist and like oppressive way. Like, if that doesn't scream colonialism, and like the fact that it comes from the United States as well, you know, like American ideas spread like no other in this world. And like, so I think it's important to consider not only like our individual positions as women, but like how women are, and it's this idea of understanding the commonality of us, and it's so hard to do that because women are everywhere. Like a lot of the times, if you're in a lower class or a particular racialized group, like a lot of those groups exist geographically, and so I think it's much easier to kind of unpack this like sense of like togetherness. Whereas women were everywhere. We're in every race, every ethnicity, every religion, like, and the only thing that binds us is our sex. And the very fact that like gender ideology is trying to erase that, it's trying to erase like the language to describe our common sense of reality, right? And like that is so divisive. And so I think like it's really, I think it just raises really important questions, like this idea of feeling a certain way versus like,
would you be okay?
How might I incorporate like other women's realities into like also my own sense of
I mean, when it comes to, again, like my own thingy with patriarchy, and I know that I'll put my hand up, I haven't read a ton of feminist literature, so like I could be spouting things, you could be like, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about, but like...
But just to say, like, one of the most important things of all feminist literature, how it came about, is the personal experience. So like, I think that's one of the most powerful things, is like how to think about the world is like through your personal sense of self.
It's my personal experience that having the victim mentality, all the everything's against me, so like I'm oppressed and all that, it's really, really bad for you.
Totally.
I don't agree with the victimhood mentality. I've been there when I was identifying as trans. I was like, oh, I'm a poor oppressed trans person, and my mental health was shot for it. Now I'm like, I'm a woman, I'm not oppressed, I don't feel oppressed, I've never encountered any obstacles. And I don't think that, like, oh my god, I'm a woman, I'm oppressed, there's things that I can't get, so why bother? It's so damaging to young women, in my opinion. And so, if you're like, oh, would you say that patriarchy is things like rape culture? That's something else I would contest. I don't think that exists. Statistically, women are raped far more common than men, but men are murdered far more common than women. So
by who? Men?
Fair dues. Like, men are obviously the ones out there doing the raping and the killing, but they're killing men as well. So you can't say they're going after and oppressing one class.
Yeah, but I think it's like rape, and like you have to look at it. I think the motivation for these things, like a lot of the time rape, like it's always, we often see headlines like, right, like so and so had sex with so and so when it was rape, right? We falsely equivalate that with sexual desire when it's actually about power, and so, it does bring up an important point, but I think that it's I totally agree with this idea of like the idea that yes, you are the essentialization of powerlessness is really, really harmful. On the other hand, it's important to recognize the way like the power hierarchy in society and the way women fit into that, but also have some kind of structure in place where you can make sense of that with other women. And at the moment, we're so individualized where we don't have outlets to like speak to other women about their experiences and like come to a common understanding of like how this is going, right? Like everyone's existing in their own bubble. Like online culture doesn't help that. Like the kind of this like really incredibly harmful narcissism doesn't help that. And so there's no like communal outlet between women to like come together and like make sense of that. And that is when it becomes harmful, is when you like when it becomes part of your individual identity rather than something, oh, this isn't actually belonging to me. This is something that exists out there in the world.
External.
That like I'm part of, but it doesn't describe or characterize who I am as a person,
Well, I can give you a precise example. Like, I don't consider myself a feminist. You could say the event that happened today was a feminist event. I still came because I stand with Mary Miller. Regardless of how I identify, I think it's ridiculous that a woman has been arrested and maybe charged for hate crime for supporting women's rights and saying, you know what, men don't belong in our fucking spaces, and posting the suffragette ribbon. But when I spoke to my friends, and I tried to get a group together, and I was like, you need to come to this, and they're like, what's it about? And I explained, and because they don't identify as feminists, they were like, oh no, you go and let us know how it went. And it's that thing where it shouldn't matter how you identify, like, oh, I'm a feminist, or I'm a this, or I'm a that, or I'm a that. It's like, no, if we can get it to the point where we're just women, and you stop picking groups and going into boxes and things like that, I think that would be a lot more beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the last like 20 years have done absolutely no favor to what counts as feminism, and I think like it's really been like warped.
You can blame the far left intersectional feminists for that shit.
Yeah.
Sex workers work, okay.
Yeah. But I think like, you know, it depends. Yeah, and I completely understand. Like, especially if someone grows up extremely religiously, for example, and then is like, you know, grows out of it or whatever, rebels and like refuses any labels, you know, because that has been a really harmful experience in their lives. I completely understand that. For me, like, I don't know that I would call myself a historian, but like I'm interested in women's history, and so for me feminism has a completely different connotation, which is just, you know, the upholding of women's rights. Like that's all it is. Like for me, it doesn't align myself with anyone. I'm just like, yeah, like I'm a feminist. Why wouldn't I be? I'm a woman.
Okay,
right?
well, let me put it this way. I don't call myself a feminist in this country. If I lived in Saudi Arabia, I would be a feminist because it's sorely needed in places like that.
What about Sharia law in this country?
Is there Sharia law in this country?
Yeah.
In Scotland?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, there's modern day slavery, there's everything. Everything you can imagine. What about the sex trade? What about prostitution? You know, all of these things are here. This is the issue because women, I believe, because women are in these positions where, you know, there's like, oh, but look at them, women can't be oppressed because there are these women doing this and these women doing this, and it disguises what is going on like beneath. You know, a lot of women don't feel oppressed day to day. You know, they like getting catcalled, you're just like, oh, that's just normal, you know, because you talk to all of your friends, they've all got catcalled. You know, how many women do I know that have been sexually assaulted and raped? Do I consider that part of my oppression, or do I consider that part of what it is just to be a woman? And you know, and women don't want to consider, no one wants to consider themselves oppressed. You know, why would you want to put that additional burden on yourself?
The trans activists want to consider themselves oppressed.
Yeah, but why is that? That's because they're not fucking oppressed at all. Only oppressed. Only people that aren't oppressed want to consider themselves oppressed. You know, if you truly are oppressed, you don't want to solidify that reality by then incorporating it as part of your identity. You know, I don't
consider liberal feminism as maybe part of patriarchy in itself.
100%. It is
disarming us and making us worry about stuff that is a bit silly almost, and so it distracts us from what's actually going underground.
I wouldn't call it patriarchy, I would call it feminists being stupid.
Well,
but they're not feminists. I'm sorry.
You know what I mean, they call themselves.
They may call themselves feminists, but feminism is for women. Sex work is not for women.
Well, this is what has damaged feminism, though, because you guys are out here. I don't know if you call yourself a feminist or a radical feminist, but for the sake of distinction, you've got the liberal feminists, the intersectional ones, and you've got the radical ones. You both call yourself feminists. Who's to say who's right? And
we are, because
but
because the
say
founding sisters. No, but we have a history. You know, especially in this country. You know, I mean, in Scotland they've got self-ID. You know, in England there is a fit. You know, in drama at school we played the suffragettes. I went to an all-girls school. You know, there is a kind of cultural recognition of feminism amongst women in the UK, and I think that's, you know, I forgot what I was going to say.
Basically, I think there's a lot of corporate interest, and patriarchy has worked through capitalist structures like social media to maybe disarm us by creating a sort of brand of feminism.
Oh, you mean like because the liberal feminists are the ones that get platformed, and they're the ones out there saying...
and they teach the young women what their actual oppressions are.
Okay.
Do you mean? And then it can all seem a bit like silly to be like storming a teacup kind of stuff compared to actual real issues.
because like...
it's a distraction kind of thing, because then you've got women complaining about the minutiae and...
Well, would a lot of this conflict even exist if social media, you know, didn't?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like social media.
It's a huge aspect.
Yeah.
Oi! Have I got a
What
drink?
did you do?
I got a drink.
You got the beers.
Right, there's another.
Does that bring this video to an end, or?
I guess so. Is it a good wrap? Have we gone through all like what we talked about?
Yeah.
I thought that was an awesome conversation. I missed the end bit of it, but